Let's introduce February's webinar. So my name is Sarah Snabel. I'm a registered kinesiologist, a certified professional ergonomist, and one of the co-owners of PROergonomics. And I'm going to host this webinar for February. And we're going to talk about office ergonomics. And maybe not necessarily in the traditional sense of, how exactly to set up your workstation, but more so how might you address office ergonomics in your workplace. So, how might you go about addressing doing an assessment, some kind of a process, what you should look for when selecting equipment or when doing an assessment, and kind of looking at it from a bigger picture. So I'll start with just kind of introducing you to PROergonomics. I know every month we tend to have some regular followers, and we always have some new people too. So I like to just touch base with and give an overview on what PROergonomics, what we do and who we are. So we are an ergonomics consulting and training company. We are all registered kinesiologists and certified professional ergonomists, or on our way to that designation. So all of the owners are certified professionals, and our staff are on their way to achieving that as well. We do a lot of work in a whole variety of industries. So office ergonomics is something that does span all types of industries, right? Everywhere you work, there's going to be computers, there's going to be the office staff, and so that's kind of across the board. But we do work in a lot of different sectors as well, municipalities, industrial or manufacturing. We work in some school boards and colleges, food processing. We've kind of been in a whole bunch of different areas, and so gives us a lot of experience and kind of the resources behind the scenes. So you may work with one consultant, and we do a good job of kind of behind the scenes teamwork, collaboration to make sure that we're really giving our customers the best end product. So in terms of what I'm going to deliver today, I'm talking about office ergonomics in any industry, right? We're talking about those who work at a computer. I am primarily speaking to, I guess, more of the larger office environments, as opposed to computers on a manufacturing floor or out on the production floor. So office ergonomics, this is my agenda for today, the kind of going through 5 main steps. And this could be, if you have not addressed office ergonomics at all in your workplace, and this could be that, you've done it and you're just looking at rejigging, tweaking, confirming that what you're doing is best practice, or, those kinds of things. So really the first step is understanding your challenges. Then, we're talking about musculoskeletal disorder injuries, the MSDs, and then having a plan. So, what are you going to do in your workplace? What's going to work? And so this is where we can kind of share some tips on what we know some of our clients are doing, other workplaces are doing, and you can kind of pick and choose to see which is going to fit best for your organization. Going through on how to assess your workstations, making those adjustments, and then actually selecting the right products when you are doing your implementation phase. So this is kind of my flow for today. So first off, we want to understand your challenges. And in the office environment, probably your number one injury is going to be those strains and sprains. So office work is not very dynamic. It is relatively sedentary. It's a lot of sitting. It's a lot of static postures. So there's not a lot of moving happening. And it's something where more and more attention is being paid to it, which is a great thing, because there's a lot of aches and pains that go along with working at a computer that can often get overlooked, and they very quickly get overlooked because it can be just a matter of, I slept funny, or, well, I've been doing this for 10 years and, it's never been a problem. I don't know what's going on right now. It must be just, something, and it'll go away, and we tend to ignore it. Or, I'm really busy. I just don't have time to address this right now. I'll figure it out later. But these injuries, these musculoskeletal disorders, MSDs, they are affecting the soft tissue. They are cumulative injuries. So it is exactly that. You may not get an issue right away, but years of working at a computer, for 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, 8 hours a day or more. Lots of us put in a lot of time at the computer, and possibly even work at a computer when we get home as well. So that cumulative exposure can really do a number on our body. And so, you may have called these repetitive strain injuries, and I put that up just because today, February 28th, happens to be National RSI Day, or Repetitive Strain Injury Awareness Day. And you could have heard other names for them as well, but ultimately they are strains and sprains. It is things like carpal tunnel syndrome, frozen shoulder, a whole variety of back injuries. It could be tendonitis. You can get tendonitis in your elbow, your shoulder, your wrist, your knee, all over the place. But it is those strains and sprains, kind of an all-encompassing term, and they're pretty prevalent in the office environment. We often think that we're just sitting, like, how can that be that bad? And there's all the media out there, that sitting is the new smoking, or sitting is toxic, sitting's going to kill us, and we should all be standing. But standing brings upon its own challenges as well. It can still be static, it can still be standing still, right? Not necessarily engaging the muscles. So we try to look at a whole variety of things here. We're talking about not moving. And that's really the big thing with office ergonomics. So working at a computer is that you're still, you're almost stuck at the computer. And so if you're starting to see signs of an MSD, these are some of the symptoms that you may be feeling. You may be hearing your staff reporting. I know of a whole variety of people logged into the call today, and you have different responsibilities in terms of, maybe you're interested for yourself, you're interested in helping employees, you're interested in accommodations and return to work. But these are the types of terms that you might hear people commenting on or complaining about. It could be just some general discomfort. They're just not comfortable at their workstation. They could be actually having some pain or discomfort in a joint or a muscle, stiffness, tightness, possibly even tingling, numbness, that pins and needles sensation, depending on how severe or how far along this injury has progressed. Ideally, we're trying to catch things early. So you want to kind of, we're trying to understand your challenges. So is this happening in your workplace? Are you having people report these types of issues? If you don't have a lot of people reporting these issues, that's probably a good thing. Maybe not necessarily why you're on the webinar today. But in general, there's a couple of people, usually a couple of staff, who are going to be experiencing some discomfort. And you might want to just, think about what these costs can be, right? So this might be that extra reasoning. So not only is it that, we want to take care of our employees, we want to make sure they're not uncomfortable at work and that we're not experiencing an injury. And we can kind of tie a bit of a financial aspect to that. I know that when we're trying to get buy-in or support from senior management, we're often asked to present some numbers. So, here's a case study just to kind of give you some ideas from an office environment. Relatively small office, so about 22 workers, but a lot of them were reporting some type of discomfort. So, not necessarily that they had a full-on injury, but reporting discomfort. And this company decided that they were going to give everybody an ergonomic assessment. They really wanted to address the equipment, and these were their numbers. So their total intervention cost was about $17,000, and that breaks down into about $11,500 on the actual equipment, the product that they ended up purchasing, and about $5,500 for the ergonomic services. So, doing some training, having a consultant come in and do the assessments. So that's roughly the cost breakdown. And what you'd want to do, so remember that number, 17,000, is compare that to what an injury could cost you. Now, for some of you, you're going to have some very specific numbers already because you have experienced staff, you have experienced staff, or you regularly experience staff reporting injuries or, going off submitting a claim. And if you don't have those specific numbers, if you're lucky enough that you haven't actually had a claim and you are trying to be proactive, you can do a quick search, but here's some examples of numbers that might help you to do that comparison. So the average cost of carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, could be about $12,000. So remember, this intervention cost was $17,000. So by them preventing one carpal tunnel injury, they've almost made back all of their money, right? We've almost had a return on investment. So for sure, 2 injuries, and we've more than made back our money. If it's a back injury claim, those are typically a higher amount, so anywhere between $30,000–$50,000. And so that ergonomic intervention, $17,000, kind of seems like a drop in the hat in the grand scheme of things in terms of what we have saved in this potential injury. Keep in mind, these numbers don't necessarily account all of those other costs, right? Like this is the direct dollar amount in the claim. It's not counting, all of the time, the new hire training, the lost productivity, all of those other costs that kind of go into that. So first step really is kind of understanding your challenges. So what's going on in your workplace and what kind of information are you going to need to justify some kind of ergonomics intervention or assessments, whatever it is. And then you're going to come up with a plan. So your plan really is going to look at, how are you going to do assessments? What is it that you're trying to achieve here? So if you are more on a reactive basis, so if you have a lot of staff who are, complaining or reporting discomfort or injuries, then you're looking at more of a reactive approach, right? So maybe it's an accommodation or a return to work need, right? So you've got a couple of people that you're looking to get back. Maybe it's that you're doing assessments just as needed. So as people are reporting issues or complaints, that's when they're doing an assessment. Maybe it's part of your inspection. So a joint health and safety inspection is identifying some issues, and that's what's going to trigger an assessment. Ideally, you're also being proactive, and possibly it's something that, you're not having a lot of injuries right now, or you're not having a lot of reports of discomfort. You just know that you want to kind of nip this in the bud early so that we don't get to that stage of having injuries. And it could be a company-wide initiative. It could be that your office is moving to a new location or you're redesigning. Maybe it's just time to replace furniture. You've got chairs that are 10 plus years old or desks that are 20 plus years old, and it's now just time to redo things. Great time to look at some kind of ergonomics plan or assessment. My suggestion to you is to really, if you're a relatively small office, then this may not be, so much to focus on in terms of where do you start. That may not be that challenging. But if you're a larger corporation, saying that we're going to do assessments for all 5,000 staff is obviously going to be a way bigger undertaking. So you might want to look at a couple of key areas to determine where you're going to start. So it could be reviewing your injury statistics or those reporting, right? So looking at, how many reports you've been having, where they've been coming from, if it's a certain department or a certain area. If you have been doing workplace inspections, maybe looking at those results. Looking at areas that tend to have more computer use than others. So there's lots of jobs where they might do a little bit of computer work, but they're kind of in and out of the office, like sales jobs type of thing, or people who go out in the field. And it could be, versus your call center employees, or people who are doing the support. So they're in the office and really, tied to the desk. There's really not much of their job they can do that's not on a computer. Those would be a great place to start. And then maybe taking an inventory. It could even be like a quick audit or a checklist, just kind of going through your office and, what is the age of your equipment? Are things wore down? Are you noticing that you have a lot of chairs where the armrests are all torn up? Are you noticing that you've got a lot of, keyboard trays that are wiggly, wobbly, that aren't as good as, they were when they first got installed? The main thing really is that you're not waiting for these reports of injuries before you start to take action, right? That would be the ideal, so that we're not fighting fires, that we are being proactive. So these would be some areas of where to start, if you're doing more of that proactive standpoint. And then I would ask you to really think about, how is one going to go about getting an ergonomic assessment? So if you're thinking in the employees, you're thinking about how are we going to initiate this process. So I want you to really think about how that's going to be done. And honestly, we work with a lot of different clients who all do this in a variety of different ways. So for example, it could be as simple as the employee says, I'd like an ergonomic assessment. And you say, oh, okay, great, we'll do that. And it could be somebody in-house. Lots of companies that we work with will have somebody in-house do it. And then And they do a lot of like the basic setups and stuff. And then it's more of the return to work or accommodation cases where they may call in a consultant or a professional to kind of help with them. And it could be that they're having, they just, report that they're having some discomfort. And again, that could trigger an ergonomic assessment. And it could be that we have some clients who require that you bring in a doctor's note. So they have to have a note from their doctor or their physiotherapist or chiropractor. And it states that they need an ergonomic assessment for a specific reason. And so we definitely have some clients that kind of go that route where they need some kind of a documentation to generate the assessment process. So just think about that. It's not necessarily that one is right or wrong, but I would definitely suggest that you have some kind of a strategy or maybe a policy and procedure in place so that you are consistent across the board. So, if so-and-so asks for an assessment and they get one and they end up getting a new chair or a new keyboard or a monitor arm or something like that, and then, so-and-so in another department asks for one, but their manager doesn't support it the same way. We don't want to have those kinds of differences across the company. We want to make sure that there is consistency. So I would suggest that you do look at some kind of a consistent strategy. It could be a policy, it could be just a procedure that's in place, just so that people know how to go about getting an assessment or how you might initiate doing an assessment. But a typical assessment, I would say in most places that we've done some work in, is that it often starts with some kind of education and training. Now, this looks different in a lot of different ways too. So there's lots of places that will talk about ergonomics, maybe in their employee orientation, or it might be an online resource that they have, like part of the onboarding training. And not even necessarily for onboarding, it can be just for all employees, right? They might have an office ergonomics component that you have to do as part of your annual training or whatnot. So some kind of education that says, here's how to set up your computer workstation. Often places will have some kind of a self-assessment checklist or those kinds of resources so that, if you are having some discomfort or you're not comfortable or you've just moved to a new workstation, you're kind of doing that self-check like on your own. So making sure that you're not necessarily calling down your health and safety person or your ergonomics person, your joint health and safety committee team, or calling in a consultant for something as simple as, oh, I didn't know how to adjust the backrest on my chair, right? So hopefully some of that education and training, those self-assessment resources can help to filter out or address some of those quote unquote easy requests. And then if people are still having issues or discomfort after they've tried to address things on their own, then you might do that assessment by a qualified individual. So this could be some steps that you do put into place in your policy and procedure, right? Or your strategy. Your strategy is that, we're going to do a workshop, we're going to do in-person training for everybody, or we're going to host this training online on our intranet, for example, that everybody can access. And then the process is, before you request an assessment, is that you have to show that you've done this checklist and that you have tried to make some adjustments on your own. And then we'll either send out our in-house person to do the assessment or call in support as needed. So that's kind of looking at the plan. Right? So we've talked about, you want to look at what's going on in your workplace and then come up with a plan on how you're actually going to do those types of assessments. So keep in mind that if you are going to be doing training, for example, or providing that education, then it is likely that people are going to have questions, right? So if I go and I say that, you've got to adjust your chair so that it fits this and this, like, you need to make sure that your chair, so that your feet are flat on the floor. You want to have your backrest to about 100 degrees, the angle. You want to make sure that your armrests are adjusted so that they're just below your elbow height. You want to make sure that your keyboard and mouse are in line with your elbow height. So the employee needs to be able to have that right equipment to be able to achieve those postures. So if you provide that education, it is important to expect that you might get some questions back, that people might need some extra equipment or something different in order to help them achieve that setup. So this might be where we talk more about assessing your workstations. And really, that is, ergonomics is about fitting the task to the worker. that's the short definition. It's the easiest definition to remember. And I like to give a good example here about, what I mean by this. So if you are sitting at your computer and we get this a lot where we see it saying, well, how come you're set up in this way? And it's like, well, this was just how it was when I got here. But really, you want to be able to adjust all of that equipment. So your keyboard, your chair, your monitor, all of that stuff should be adjusted to fit you and not the other way around. So if you sit at your desk and you are raising your chair up and your feet are dangling, or you're sitting down with your feet flat on the floor, but you've got your shoulders raised and you're feeling a lot of tension because when you're trying to type, you feel your keyboard's too high, or you're having the desk rub on your forearms or your wrists, that's an example of you adjusting your body to fit the workstation, which is tricky, right? That's problematic. Over time, that's that cumulative exposure of the awkward postures. In the static posture, you're not moving, you're adopting an awkward posture. It's going to cause some of that cumulative trauma to your soft tissues. So ideally, you want to make sure that all of your equipment fits you. So part of your education is going to be, telling people how to set up their workstation, and then your assessment part, the kind of the follow-up process. I mean, just having the education is one thing, but if you're not following up on that to make sure that the staff can actually do what your education has told them to do, that's a gap. So a couple different resources that you might be able to use. And again, office ergonomics isn't necessarily rocket science. There are a lot of it is pretty straightforward. A lot of it is relatively easy to follow, and we do have a lot of guidelines and standards out there. The CSA has just released a new, it's always been called a guideline, but this year, at the end of last year, they released a standard. They've now updated it and called it a standard. So there's some now updates to it. And that's a great resource, a paid resource, mind you. You do have to pay for it to read it. And there's lots of other resources. I mean, you can check out CCOHS is a great online resource in terms of, what is a proper office ergonomic setup. There are lots of, for example, we have lots of articles on our website, some resources that you can look up. You can look up different insurance boards across the country, like WorkSafe BC and in Alberta, and there's a good standard in New Brunswick as well. And those are all free resources. So there's lots of information out there in terms of being able to deliver that training, to get yourself familiar, or somebody in-house familiar with how to do those assessments. And you can also rely on, in some cases, you can rely on vendors to help you out with that assessment, or making sure that you're picking the right products, or getting the right fit. So your chair vendor, for example, making sure that they're letting you know all the right features that are in a chair. You still need to be the educated consumer, but you can get a lot of information from some of them. And I'm not going to say all of them are created equal. Definitely, you want to make sure that you are asking the right questions and not just relying on them to say, this is the, keep in mind that they're still in sales. And then you have other resources too, like consultants. You might be bringing in a third party to help you with doing your assessment or possibly your training. And my word of advice to you is just to make sure that you're checking their qualifications and experience, to make sure you are getting somebody who is doing what they say they're doing. We work with a lot of different we work with our clients in different capacities. So we have lots of clients who do in-house assessments, and they deal with most of them. And then when it gets to maybe a tricky one, so something where they've visited the employee a couple of times and they're still having challenges, maybe it is a return to work or a WSIB case, maybe it is something where, they've just had, the message just isn't getting through, and they want that kind of third party, that professional opinion to kind of help make the recommendation stick. Those are a couple different ways that we do work with some of our clients. And in some cases we work with, that we do most of the assessments because it's more of a volume thing or a time or resource thing. So, they could do the assessments, but just finding that the time that it takes to go out and do them, or kind of their knowledge or ability or skill set just isn't where they want it to be. And so then they kind of outsource, so they contract out the assessments. So a couple different ways that you might be looking for resources or help. if you are going to be doing these assessments in-house, so some kind of a follow-up, or somebody's reporting discomfort and you're going to check out their workstation, a couple of words of suggestion for you. So make sure that you are standardized. So regardless of who's this, this is kind of part of your plan, right? So coming up with your policy and procedure, or that strategy on how you're going to do an assessment, part of that should be, okay, so now we've triggered an assessment, how are we going to do it? So that you're doing the same process regardless of who it is. So regardless of it's the planning department or the finance department, regardless of whether it's Bill or Sue, regardless of it's for an injury or not an injury, that you want to make sure that you are following the same process so that everybody's kind of getting an equal assessment, and then we're not potentially showing bias, or really making sure that it's objective, right? So I would suggest making sure that you are using some form of standardized checklist. And that way then also that you're not missing anything. So when you go out and do an assessment, you're looking at the chair, the keyboard, the mouse, the monitor, their other accessories, and you kind of have all of those steps to make sure that everybody is getting the same type of assessment. That's really what helps to ensure your objectivity. Ideally, you're observing the employee working as well. Having them, they might say or show you doing one thing, like sitting great in the chair, and then if you ask them to quickly look up or type an email, what you might find is that when they're actually working, they're actually not using the backrest. Or you might kind of notice some little nuances like that weren't necessarily obvious when you just kind of get them when you're just sitting there talking with them. So ideally, you're doing some sort of observation with the employee. I kind of like it when the phone does ring in the middle of my assessment, I say, oh no, please get it. Like, I'll just make some notes, and it's kind of a way that I am actually observing them in their more natural state, as opposed to that interview time with me. I like taking pictures as well, and that's, for one thing, I take pictures when I do my assessments to make sure that I'm kind of showing a before and after picture. So before I made adjustments, after I made adjustments, but I also use those as well to show the employee, to show them the kind of postures that I'm observing, so that, because how often do you really look at yourself sitting at your own workstation? You might think that you're sitting all right, but not necessarily noticing that you do tend to lean forward when you look at your monitor, or you're tipping your head up to look at the monitor. You may not necessarily notice that. So sometimes I take those pictures from the side and show the employee throughout the assessment. It kind of helps with the buy-in as well, to kind of make sure that they're understanding, I've adjusted your monitor, and here's why, right? So here's the posture. Here's what it was before. Here's what it was after. Like, look how much better. This is what straight looks like. This is what neutral posture looks like. And it kind of gets to them familiar with what's going on. Asking lots of questions too. I always like to ask questions in terms of what type of tasks they do. I want to know how much time they spend at the computer versus not at the computer. I want to get to know, can they live without a number pad? If I'm seeing a lot of bad, or reaching to the mouse, for example, I was going to say bad shoulder postures, but if they're, reaching to the mouse, I might want to look for some other solutions here, but I want to know what their work tasks are. I do want to know a little bit about their preferences in terms of, are they willing to try to left-hand mouse? I want to know if they, are going to, I want them to be able to, I want them to do and follow up on the recommendations that I've made. So if I'm recommending a new product, or if I'm recommending a change in work method, I want it to be easy for them to adopt. If I'm making all these impractical recommendations, I know it's not going to stick, and we haven't necessarily solved the problem. So just some things to keep in mind if you do happen to be the person who is doing the in-house assessments. Really. But good posture should be comfortable, and there's lots of diagrams out there that kind of show that you need to be in this 90-90-90 type of posture, and then that is good posture. But you want to make sure that the person, or yourself, if it's you taking home some tips today in terms of how to adjust your computer workstation, that you're comfortable, but making sure also that we're not, because if a person says, you go and do the assessment, for example, and the person says, well, this is comfortable for me, but you're really noticing that it's not a great posture. You know, you've gone through the standards, you've read different guidelines, you know that the monitor should be a certain height, you're seeing them kind of work with their head tipped up, so you're seeing an awkward neck posture when they're working, but they're telling you, well, this is just what's comfortable for me. Those are the things that you're going to want to work through and really provide that education, that encouragement on change, right? We need to make sure that we're changing that. Because they say they're comfortable or they like it that way or that's how they've always been doing it, sometimes that kind of element of comfort. So it's not the other way. Good posture should equal comfort, but comfort in terms of some people's interpretations of it does not always equal good posture, right? So we do want to make sure that when we're doing assessments that we really are following those guidelines and standards, because we're trying to be proactive or prevent issues from happening down the road. So somebody might be working that way, they don't have any neck discomfort, maybe you're there for a whole different reason, but you don't want to, now that you've identified that there is some awkward neck postures, you don't want to leave them that way. Okay, so now making some adjustments. Now, this could be, what we find is that there are lots of different solutions, but there's a couple of key areas that you're going to want to address when you're doing an assessment or, you know, you provide that education. There's a couple of key areas. So one is the chair, right? Now, this is a pretty big deal. The chair is one of the most important things. If somebody is not able to get comfortable in their chair, it's hard for them. You know, I talked about the definition of ergonomics being making sure that you can adjust all the equipment to fit the worker. The chair really is that foundational piece. So if you can't get comfortable in the chair, it's hard to adjust everything else to get comfortable as well, right? You'll be fidgeting in the chair. You might be having some back pain or discomfort. It might be the armrests just aren't in the right spot and they're not allowing you to get in close to your workstation, right? Maybe the armrests are bumping on the desk. So the chair really is the key thing. And anytime that I do an assessment, I always start there, regardless of whether or not somebody has reported issues with their chair or not. I always start there, because if I can get them comfortable in the chair, I'm pretty confident that I can adjust everything else. I can move other things. I can move the keyboard or mouse. I can move the monitor to work with them, to fit to them, right? If I can't get them comfortable in the chair, then I know right away that I'm probably going to have to look for a different solution in the chair, because it's hard to kind of do band-aid solutions on a chair. So the chair is really the big thing, and you do want to look for adjustability, but you know, keep in mind that a chair can have, you know, chair prices can vary a whole ton. I'm sure you know that if you've ever tried to shop for a chair, and there's a lot of different chair options out there, like an overwhelming amount of chair options. But, you know, again, refer to those CSA guidelines, standard now, in terms of what features you should have as a minimum in a chair. And usually that would be that the seat goes up and down for height, that your armrests go up and down, again, for height, that your backrest can adjust in the recline, that those are probably the big ones there. And then other things that we see is that you want to have like lumbar support. So having the backrest go up and down with some kind of a curvature in the low back of that backrest is important, right? You want to make sure that people of different heights, people of different, you know, shapes and sizes can use the same chair, because ideally you're trying to standardize, right? You're probably going to have, most people anyways, most companies typically have one or two variations of chairs throughout, right? It can get pretty expensive, especially if you go through your office and you've got like 10 different models of chair. You definitely get better pricing when you buy in bulk. And then it kind of aesthetically, it all looks the same too. So you're looking for a chair that's going to have a lot of adjustability to make sure that it can fit your 5 feet tall workers and your 6 feet tall workers. Other features, I mean, there's tons of other features you can consider as well. You could have pivoting armrests or with adjustable armrests. You can have a rocking function in the chair. But really, the important thing to remember is that you've got some of those basic adjustments: seat height, backrest and the lumbar support, the back support, and having the armrests adjustable. Gosh, I could talk a lot on chairs. I really could. I could probably do like a whole webinar or a whole workshop just on talking about chairs, just based on the number of assessments we do and questions that we get about chairs. So if anybody does have any specific questions about chairs, by all means, send me an email and I'm happy to talk with you further, but I won't dwell on that in the webinar today. So once you get somebody comfortable in their chair, and honestly, when I'm doing an assessment, I would actually have the person turn completely away from their keyboard and mouse, like turn away from their computer and get the chair all set up. Because often we try to make adjustments to the chair to kind of fit the workstation, right? Like you want to set them up so their feet are flat on the floor, get everything all set up. And then what you're going to do to go on to the next step of your assessment is turn them around to face the keyboard and the monitor. Have their arms bent to about 90 degrees, have their elbows bent to a 90-degree angle, and compare. So when they have their arms set like that, is the keyboard and mouse at their elbow height? Does it rest just under their hands? And if you find that it's too high, then what you're going to want to do is, a couple of different things. It could be like the height of the keyboard and mouse is often a big deal. It's probably the most common thing that we address when doing an assessment. So there's a couple of options that you have. One is either to raise the chair up and make sure you give the person a footrest so their feet aren't dangling. And that way then you're able to, raise everything up to get them to that elbow height, right? We want everything at elbow height. Elbow height is kind of that working height. It's that key height that we use for working in an office. Working everywhere. Elbow height is kind of that natural working height. So that's one option, is that you could bring the chair up, and that might be a minimal purchase that you need to do. Maybe they don't have a footrest. You're going to need to get them a footrest to make sure that their feet are supported at that height. Or it could be that you implement a keyboard tray to lower the keyboard and mouse down to them. So keep their chair down at that lower height with their feet flat on the floor, bring the keyboard and mouse down to them. I mean, if you had height adjustable desk, then you could just do that too, but obviously that's expensive and that's not necessarily the route that I would go to. I would look into the task that the person is doing, what's the right fit, and I would always look for the more cost-effective solution. So key adjustments with chair, the height of the keyboard and mouse, and then the position of the monitors. So this is going to include height. So you want the top portion of the monitor to be in line with your eye height. So not that you should be in line with the center of your screen. The top of the monitor should be in line with your eye height. Sort of some different rules. If you wear bifocals, you're going to want to put it a lot lower to kind of align with where you're looking out of your glasses to see the screen. And if you're using dual monitors, keep in mind that you don't want to be twisting a whole ton. So one screen really should be your primary screen so that you're looking most of the time straight ahead, and that second screen should be a secondary or a reference screen, and you can angle it onto the right or left side. If you're curious more about monitor positioning, we did post some articles on monitor positioning, just some quick little tips on our news section of our website, so feel free to check those out. Those are some great tips, and again, ask questions as well. But these are the key adjustments when doing an assessment. These are the key things that you want to take into consideration when doing an assessment. And then you want to make sure you select the right product. So I did comment that there's, a ton of chair options out there, but the same kind of goes for other products as well. Which keyboard tray do you select? Which keyboard do I pick? I think I might need a different keyboard. Maybe I need one of those wave keyboards. Maybe I need a different mouse because the person is experiencing some elbow or forearm discomfort or shoulder discomfort, and I want to look for a different product, right? You want to make sure that you're selecting the right product. And, we did a webinar last month actually on, what does ergonomic equipment really mean? If you do a quick Google search, even just on the Staples website, you're going to get thousands of hits. The word ergonomic can often be used as a marketing gimmick. So you do want to make sure that you are a little savvy in terms of selecting the right product. So adjustability is always a good thing, because then it means that you could potentially buy one product that would fit a host of people. But something that I would suggest as a really good idea, if you don't already have it in place, is some sort of a purchasing standard or some type of a purchasing guideline, something along those lines, especially if you're a larger company where, you've got multiple departments and they're kind of purchasing things on their own. So, let's say finance needs to get a new chair. They have an employee that needs a new chair, and so they go out and pick a new chair. But then planning, they need a new chair. It's a different manager doing the purchasing, and so they pick a chair based on what they're familiar with. And, this is very quickly how you're going to notice that when you walk through a company that you've got 6 different chair models going throughout there. Some chairs are better than others. Really, there's no standardization, and that can get a little tricky. So if you really like a gold standard, a really best in class type of thing to have is some sort of a purchasing standard, so that when somebody, this is all again part of your plan in terms of how do you initiate that assessment, how does that assessment take place, who does it, and what does that assessment look like? And then how do people then follow up on those recommendations that were made? So if additional products or equipment are needed, how is it that they're going to get those? And so your purchasing standard could have, 1 or 2 different chairs on that list so that people know where to go to purchase them. Same, you might have a couple of different keyboards or mice options that are on there. So something that kind of helps to limit the mass variety of equipment throughout your workplace. And check out our January webinar too. I'm not going to go into a whole ton of detail talking about all those different product things to select, but Jen did a really good job talking about what does ergonomic equipment really mean, and kind of help, the goal of that really is to become an educated consumer. So check that out. We do post most of our webinars on our YouTube channel. But a good thing, is get people to trial. Like a purchasing standard is a good thing. As you're in that process of creating one, you can bring in, it's kind of like a rule of 3, or that's a good guideline. So, bring in 3 chairs and trial them, get feedback, make sure that all 3 of them though are equal in the sense that they meet those minimum standards. Often when people do trials, that's kind of, they come and they sit for 5 minutes or less and yeah, this feels comfortable. But it can be a different story when you actually get to working in it. And I'll give you kind of an example of somebody that we worked with where it was kind of a trial gone not so great. So they brought in, they were moving to a new location. So it was a redesign. They were moving to a new location. They were going to purchase all new chairs because the other chairs were relatively old. It was time for a replacement anyways. They brought in 3 chairs and had all of the staff vote on them. And they picked the chair that most staff voted for. And they implemented that across the entire department. But guess what? It's only been 2 years, now almost 3 years since that move. And gosh, you wouldn't believe the number of complaints that we get about that chair, because people, now that they've been sitting in it, really just aren't finding it comfortable. A key thing that chair was missing was lumbar support, but it had a mesh back. And so that was something that people, when they sat in it very quickly for that trial period, they thought that was pretty comfortable. It's just that what they actually found is in practice, in reality, it wasn't the right amount of support that they needed for their full day at the computer. So here it is, not even 3 years in. Guess what this department decided to do based on the number of accommodations? They've been getting a lot of requests for assessments and replacing chairs because people are having discomfort and even injury claims. So not even 3 years in, they've gone and replaced all of their chairs. They're going to do it over the next year or 2, but huge waste of money. We're talking like 100 workstations, all these chairs that just, weren't the right fit. So just be careful when you're doing those trials, not to scare you, but just to be smart about it. So in summary, again, it's kind of coming up with, knowing your challenges. So what's going on in your workplace and coming up with a plan. So how are you going to address it? Are you doing it more reactive? Are you looking at a proactive approach? And then coming up with that kind of procedure or that strategy in terms of how you're going to deliver the education, the assessment, and the follow-up. So actually getting people set up in the right postures at their computer. Posture really is important. So as much as we kind of talk about, equipment and accessories, they can help, but they can actually hinder good posture. They're not going to actually cause good posture. We still need to remember that it is up to the user, it's up to the person to take the initiative and make those adjustments. I could give you a top of the line chair. I could give you a chair that costs $1,500, like, something super expensive, has every single bell and whistle on it. But if you don't take the time to adjust it, guess what? Doesn't fit you that great. You're not really getting the full benefit out of it. So in that case, that good equipment hasn't created good postures. It's still up to the individual to take that initiative. So that education component is key. So it goes hand in hand. I don't necessarily think that you can do one and not the other. So if you're going to do education, but not necessarily provide the right equipment, you've got a gap. If you're going to provide great equipment, but not necessarily provide the education on how to use it or ensure that people, have that knowledge, again, you've got a gap. We need to kind of have both together complementary in order to truly have the proper setup, right? If you want a good ergonomics program, a good office ergonomics program, you're kind of doing both hand in hand. So at this time, just noticing the clock, it is 1:45. So if anybody has any questions, feel free, use that little chat window and you can type away and ask any questions, and then I'll kind of read some of those questions out loud and we'll go from there. In terms of education in our webinar, like as I mentioned, I really do think that education and that assessment process, the education and having the right equipment, goes hand in hand. And so something for this webinar, for all of you who are attending or who have registered for this webinar and are listening in to, I am recording this, so it'll be posted on our website. So for anybody who is interested, what we're offering for February is a free 1-hour office ergonomics training session when you do 10 workstation reviews. And so what that means is that we would do a training session, ideally like in the morning, and then people who attended the training session would get a visit from an ergonomist. So from that trainer would go around and spend 20 to 30 minutes with each person to kind of help tweak their workstation. So the whole idea is that they get the education, they go back to their workstation, try to make some adjustments on their own, and then an ergonomist would come around and kind of help tweak, help them address anything that was outstanding that they couldn't get on their own. So for this month, what we would do, what we're offering, and if you're interested in taking us up on this offer, you just need to send me an email. It's as easy as that. So the training session will be free as long as you do 10 workstation reviews afterwards. So let's take a look at some of the questions. I will read them out loud to you. I'm not sure that when you guys type a question, I don't think it goes to everybody. 1 second here. You guys can't see this, but I just need to be able to open up my questions here. Okay, here's the question. What is the WSIB acceptance for carpal tunnel syndrome now in regards to repetitive strain injury? I'm actually not sure that I 100% understand that question. If the person who asked this question could elaborate in terms of what you mean there, I am happy to address that. Here's another question. How many times should you follow up with an employee after they have received their assessment? Great question. So as a consultant, this is something that is somewhat challenging for us because we don't work in-house, but what we would suggest is that if you've done a thorough assessment the first time through, then you'd want to do at least a brief follow-up just to make sure that the person has received all the equipment, that they know how to adjust it, and that it truly is helping to work with them. I don't know if there's a specific number of times that you're wanting to go back. You might, like, I kind of want to say that if you've done a really good job the first time and then you go and do a follow-up, you might have to do a little bit of tweaking then, but it shouldn't take a whole lot more visits after that. Because if that's the case, if you're going back 3, 4, 5 times to the same employee and you find that you're addressing the same concerns, then I'm kind of curious if something was maybe missed in that initial assessment or that initial follow-up assessment as well. So ideally, we're doing a nice thorough job right up front. Oh, and a follow-up question to that is, and how long after should you be doing the follow-up assessment? So for sure, I'd want to do a follow-up assessment after they've gotten all of the equipment. So let's say I recommend a keyboard tray and a footrest, and I've recommended for them to try left-handed mousing. I would want to make sure that I'm doing that follow-up assessment after they've received that equipment. Like hopefully the equipment's not taking months and months on end to get, but I want to make sure that that new equipment, if I have recommended it, has been implemented, and that would be a great time to do at the very least a follow-up call, right, to make sure you got the equipment, have you taken the time to adjust it, and give me your quick feedback. If it's something like a work method change, if we've done something more like bigger, that's going to take some time to adapt, I would want to follow up after a couple of weeks. I want to give them some time to try out this new work method, to try out this new kind of positioning that we've set up, to make sure that they've really had an opportunity to try it out. So I'd probably say a couple of weeks. There's not necessarily a hard and fast rule to that, though. It does kind of depend on the level of discomfort they might be experiencing, and again, the extent of the recommendations or changes that I've made. So follow up to that first question, that what is the WSIB acceptance for carpal tunnel syndrome now in regards to repetitive strain injuries? So carpal tunnel syndrome is now seen as more gripping and pinching and not a repetitive strain injury. Is this what you are understanding from employers that you visit? Interesting. So carpal tunnel syndrome, honestly, let's say I look at the last 10 assessments that I've done, I don't think a single person has actually reported carpal tunnel syndrome. There are lots of times when I do assessments and I don't actually have a diagnosis. Like maybe I don't, because they may not have necessarily had to present a doctor's note, or that they might have a doctor's note, but I didn't see it. And in some cases, that's not always relevant to me. If they tell me that they're having discomfort in their wrist, to me, it doesn't necessarily matter if it was wrist tendonitis or if it was carpal tunnel syndrome. I know that I'm trying to improve their postures. I want to look at, where am I seeing some bad or awkward postures, and where's my opportunity for improvement. So I don't know that I'm necessarily seeing the same. I'm not necessarily seeing anything specific about this gripping and pinching specifically. And I'm happy to follow up with you in more detail if you have a specific case or a specific instance. We can just quickly chat on the phone and talk about that if I haven't fully addressed your question here. Question: what do you think of doing some breaks during the workday to avoid the sedentary lifestyle and injuries? Love it. So this is great. I didn't even really touch on sit-to-stand workstations, which is probably our #1 request these days, is asking for our opinion on whether or not we think people should be standing at work. And we've done webinars just on that, and we do have some articles on our website as well. But I 100% think that movement is key. So something that I always recommend, or I have that conversation with the staff when I'm doing the assessments, and I deliver it in my training as well, is that we need to think about moving. So just like I said that you could have a top of the line chair, has all the bells and whistles, maybe you have adjusted it perfectly for you and you're super comfortable when you're sitting, but you know what, if you don't move, if you're not engaging those muscles, you're still going to get uncomfortable. Inevitably, over the course of a day, you're going to get uncomfortable, right? Our muscles like to move. So we need to find ways to, it can be taking breaks, making sure that you take your breaks away from your computer. You get a lunch break for 30 minutes or an hour, don't take it at your computer. Get up, get away. That's your opportunity to get up and move. Look for other opportunities to move. It could be as simple as standing up when you're talking on the phone, right? You don't necessarily have to have that sit-to-stand workstation. And again, I could go on and on. I can get pretty passionate when we talk about these sit-to-stand workstations, but definitely encouraging movement to kind of combat this quote-unquote sitting disease is my #1 recommendation, as opposed to recommending a standing workstation for everybody. Another question, is there a possibility that you'll send us the presentation? Yes, we'll send it a webinar recording afterwards so that you can reference it at your convenience. And if you are interested specifically in the slides, just send me a specific email. We don't typically send out the slides, only because we do post the recording. And so we find the recording goes much better hand in hand. Sometimes the slides kind of lose context on their own. Okay, another question. Do you have any suggested tools to help the employee be alerted to stand up and stretch? We have a few employees that tend to stay at their desk all day long and only leave their desk for a very small amount of time. Excellent question. I do know of some apps that are out there. In terms of which one would I recommend, I often don't really recommend them. So I don't necessarily have one or two that are my favorite. I think that you could use any of those. I might recommend a couple to people to try. But what I find is that people, if they find them annoying, like over time, if you say that you're going to get up every hour or whichever, they may find that they just start to ignore them. They hit snooze on them, and ultimately they're not necessarily used. What I often try to suggest is to get people to really think about what is movement. So what is it? What are things that they do? When are times when they can move from their desk and get up, and try to do that? So again, I mentioned that every time the phone rings, if you use that as a cue that you're going to stand up, and maybe you can remain standing while you're talking on the phone, but maybe you have to sit back down because you need to look something up on the computer. So kind of use that as an opportunity to hit your posture reset button. It could be that when somebody comes into your office, you stand up and you talk with them, as opposed to staying sitting, right? I think sometimes those interruptions can actually be shorter too if you stand up. There's kind of that element of urgency or disruption, right? I don't know, but sometimes I don't always necessarily recommend the apps. I try to encourage people to find ways to move kind of within their natural flow of tasks, right? It could be getting up to do filing. It could be getting up to go get their printing. Not saying that the apps are bad, just in general, the feedback that I've heard is that they work short term, but not necessarily something that sticks with people. What is your email address? Great question. So email address is info@proergonomics.ca. Let me actually just advance the slide. I think, there we go. Questions, any questions you can send, send to info@proergonomics.ca. Again, my name is Sarah Snable. That's our main phone number. Other questions. What are your thoughts on fidget boards for standing workstations? Ooh, interesting question. I am going to say that I am not super familiar with fidget boards. I'm thinking those are like a stability type of thing. And so when I recommend standing workstations, I have not ever recommended a fidget board with them. I'm always erring on the side of safety and caution. Just my experience in the workplace is that I want to make sure that I am not creating new problems. So when somebody is standing, usually what goes along with my recommendation and my discussion in the assessment process is making sure that we're making smart footwear choices. I might recommend a footrest that goes under the workstation, in particular one that does have some good gripping on it. Not necessarily those cheap plastic ones that are kind of slippery. I want like a decent grip on it so that you could kind of put one foot up and alternate postures, but not necessarily a fidget board or like a stability ball or anything along those lines. Okay, I think I have addressed all the questions that have come in. Thanks everybody so much for attending today. Again, if you have any other questions, if anything pops up at a later date, feel free please to send me an email. Or give us a call, and also check out our website. We do have some other webinars recorded from previous months that do address a variety of different topics, like sit to stand, like being an educated consumer and selecting the right product, like addressing the sitting disease. I think if you go back, we might even have one on developing a purchasing standard. So check out those resources that are available to you, and best of luck when doing that. We'll follow up with an email too to remind you all of that offer for this month, and hope that you all have a great Wednesday. Thanks so much.